directly with us. Thanks for coming down, Peter.
Thank you. Well, I think that I like that song that is this band is called the Funky Nixons or something, I think, and I like the title of that, and I like the song, and it reminded me of an old saying, which is a little spark can start a prairie fire. And so I think this is a little spark, and there needs to be a prairie fire. This is the second time I've been here to rally on the steps of this beautiful post office, and the first one, you know, I couldn't help but notice that most of the people are my age or older, and you know, I think it's really interesting that on the one hand there's this myth that the internet and the email and Web 2.0 has killed the Postal Service, which is not true, and I'll talk about that in a second. On the other hand, there's also a feeling, I think, among people under 40s mostly, that they don't really need the U.S. mail anymore, which is a vastly misinformed feeling. Because, for one thing, rural areas depend on the mail, you know, packages depend on the mail. I mean, there's so many things that depend on the mail. There's a flip side to it, of course, because the other day the Postal Service floated an idea that they could get further funding by having postal carriers enter the home and take care of elderly people, which is insane. Plus, they're also photographing the outside of every piece of mail. It's 165 billion pieces a year that goes through the system. But that aside, the people that actually deliver the mail are pretty cool. The executives, on the other hand, are not. And that's what we're here to talk about, really, is that the postal system in the United States is clearly a part of the commons. It was created with public money, and now it's being privatized. And this is really part of a kind of global privatization movement, as it were, that we see particularly going on since the crash of 2008. I mean, before that, of course, we saw the likes of Exxon and Halliburton and J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs thriving on invading other countries and basically stealing their natural resources. But they want more. Capital always needs money, or you know, it dies in its own opinion, and it needs to grow. And so now the capitalist system, I think, has started to look inwards into America and see what it can take. Roads are actually being privatized. Schools are being privatized, led by Bill Gates and the likes of that. And the Postal Service is owns some of the most valuable and most widespread real estate portfolio in the country. I mean, they've got hundreds of millions of square feet, and it's generally located in inner cities like, you know, this post office, or in very valuable warehouse and parking lot complexes in the suburbs that are being developed. So it doesn't take a genius to say, well, let's take this and monetize it. So how did that happen? Well, probably a lot of people here already know that in 2006, Congress passed this weird, strange law declaring that the Postal Service had to prepay 75 years' worth of retirement health care pension funds, which amounted to $5.5 billion a year hit over 10 years to its budget, which drove it from a healthy black into a very diseased red. Using that politicized and arbitrary budget-killing device as an excuse to open the doors to further privatization, we end up with the selling of the post offices. Now, when I say further privatization, it's important to look at who actually is contracting with the post office right now. Its major contractors are FedEx and UPS and trucking companies and airlines like Kalitta Airlines, which gets like $350 million a year to fly mail to soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. That sounds like a pretty good gig to me. Now, there's an argument to be made that the Postal Service has already been privatized, and I think that's true. And so what we're seeing is the sealing of the deal. And part of that is taking the land and turning it over to the private sector, with the goal being, in the end, that the entire delivery of mail in America will be turned over to the private sector. It's an interesting problem because, on the one hand, the Postal Service bureaucracy is horrible, and you know, there's a lot of feather bedding going on and stuff like that. But it is like the biggest remaining union in America, which is really important. And most of the people that work for the post office are perfectly, you know, responsible, hardworking people. But the people at the top are the ones that are doing this. And what they did was, in 2011, they gave a contract to one company, CBRE, C.B. Richard Ellis, to sell and handle the leasing for every piece of postal real estate in America, which next to military bases is the largest element in the federal government's portfolio. It's a vast portfolio. Now, the first thing that was done was they created a website and they put up a bunch of post offices like the Venice post office and this post office. Post offices which have historic murals in them and beautiful architecture. And this tended to incense upper middle class white people in these towns, just like right here. You know, you're selling our post office, how dare you? And, you know, it's just, it spread like a little bit of a prairie fire. You know, even in the rural areas of Florida now, when the powers that be come in and say, we're going to sell your post office, people, the orange growers are like, you know, why? Don't do this. So I think eventually that people will kind of all across the country come around and coalesce around this issue, which is why I'm happy I was able to do this investigation, because it's information that people need. And to make a long story short, what happened was, you know, you might think, well, when you're looking at what the consequences of privatizing an organization in a deal like this, you might think, well, they're going to sell the post offices for more money than they're worth so they can get high commissions. But it's actually very counterintuitive. That's not what happened. That's not how things really work. What happened here was that they sold the post office for far, far, far under their actual fair market values, often to the business partners and clients of CBRE, which is chaired and largely owned by the husband of Diane Feinstein, as I said before. The mechanism by which that happened was that the contract said that CBRE was required to sell these post offices at fair market value, which means the highest and best price that you can get in the current market. What most people probably don't understand is that, yeah, the real estate prices went down a lot after 2008, but in the commercial area, they've actually come up very steeply. They're almost back to pre-crash levels, especially for inner city real estate that can be turned into residential units and boutiques and office buildings. And what people also need to understand is that it's not just about real estate, it's about investments. Real estate returns about 7% for your REIT type investor right now, as opposed to like your savings account, which like probably takes money out of your pocket, right? So CBRE is not really only the world's largest commercial real estate firm, it is a huge investment bank. Most of its business is churning real estate deals for investors all over the world. Incidentally, even though it's owned by the husband of a United States senator, they don't like to pay income taxes. They keep a good deal of their money in offshore accounts precisely so that they won't have to do that, which I find interesting. So what happened was that this contract said they had to sell it at fair market value, highest and best use, and what they obviously were doing was selling some of them at fair market value, the ones that were most visible, like in Venice and Fairfield, Connecticut, places like that. The other ones, it appeared to me, it stunk. So I went and looked up the actual appraised value of every one of the 52 deals that CBRE had done over the first 2 years of this contract, and discovered that 85% of them were sold very, very far under their, tended to be sold very, very far under their assessed values. Assessed values are the price at which it was last sold, which might be 20 years ago, you know. It's a complex kind of situation, and I go into it in great detail, not in the East Bay Express article, but in the e-book that I published called Going Postal, how U.S. Senator Feinstein's husband is selling post offices to his friends cheap, which is on Amazon. And I realize that some people say, well, I don't have a Kindle, I can't read it. Well, the good news is you don't need a Kindle. You need a computer. You can get a free app on Amazon and read it on just about any device. And thanks to the kindness of strangers, pretty soon you'll be able to get a print version of the ebook on Amazon as well. The great evil Amazon, I'm afraid to say, is taking over the world, but let's not get left behind, at least in this prairie fire. So you'll be able to go there and get the print copy as well. And that lays out in detail every single one of those 52 deals that they did. Now, I do want to talk a few minutes about the Freedom of Information Act, which I used to get initial data that enabled me to do this year-long investigation. And what I was able to get, after a lot of jumping up and down and screaming and yelling and threatening with lawyers, was a list of all the properties that CBRE had sold for the post office over the 2-year period, the amount that it was sold for, the address of the property, and who it was sold to, or for who it was sold to. And then I tracked that down, and the result, is history. But they wouldn't tell me how much CBRE had appraised each one of these post office parcels at. They wouldn't tell me what the fair market value was that CBRE was contractually required to get in the sale. They basically, one of their lawyers told me that it was equivalent to a national security secret. Now, I can assure you that it is in fact not classified information, but short of a lawsuit, we're not going to find out. On the other hand, it's possible to know what the bottom of what the fair market value is, which is the assessed value, and it's only if you look at standard real estate practice, you realize that the assessed value is usually about maybe a third, or even maybe sometimes half of what the fair market value is. So if you can determine what the assessed value is, which I did, then you can determine that this giant ripoff is going on. The other element of it is that in normal real estate ethical practice, the agents are required to remain at arm's length from each other, which means that if you're representing the buyer, you can't have the interest of the seller, and vice versa. In this case, in direct violation of its contract for the first year, CBRE was often representing not just the post office as the seller, but its own clients and business partners as the buyers. In Boston, CBRE was partnered with a venture called Commonwealth Ventures, which is redeveloping the seaport area of downtown Boston. And it sold a nice, juicy piece of land there to itself, basically, for substantially under its market value. They sold it for $10 million, and it had been assessed 20 years before at $20 million. Excuse me, $12 million. And then they turned around and sold a nice piece of property to Goldman Sachs, which it turns out owns like 7% of CBRE, is one of its major shareholders. And they have all sorts of deals. I mean, it's Blum and Blum Capital Partners, which is Blum's investment bank, and CBRE and Goldman run the world. Just like Matt Taibbi said, they stick their blood funnels into anything that stinks of money, right? And so they're not selling the properties at fair market value. They're not obeying the contract and best practices in real estate mandate of remaining at arm's length from each other in the sale. And they're also violating the contract by turning around and renting back the property that they just sold to somebody back to the post office, which is really insane. First they get a sub-market price for the post office, and then they rent it back for hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. It just means that the post office is just bleeding that cash. So basically the $200 million that they thought they were going to generate as ready cash by selling off all this real estate is probably a complete wash due to the costs of having to go down the street and rent a new building, because you still need a post office. I mean, people don't understand, actually, the post office is kind of like provides the arteries, of commerce in this country, which is a whole nother story we don't have time to get into. But I will say that if you want to reestablish black ink in the post office budget, all that actually needs to be done is to charge businesses the cost of mailing their junk mail. First-class mail subsidizes junk mail. That's all that needs to be done. Everything will be hunky-dory after that. Now, I want to conclude by saying, why do we care about this in terms of, if you look at Lockheed Martin or, Halliburton or Booz Hamilton or whoever has these, huge government contracts and is on the record, as we can show investigation after investigation, not delivering what they're supposed to be delivering. If you pick up a copy of the Federal Times, which nobody knows about because only reporters and federal government employees read it, it's put out by Gannett, comes out every week, it covers the federal government from inside, and it's fascinating reading because you would think they should all be in prison. I mean, just week after week after week, they're talking about people stealing millions of dollars, all the way from Larry Ellison and Oracle, which recently was dinged for like stealing basically $90 million in mispricing a contract with the Postal Service, down to the level of the agents that are getting double commissions for selling these post offices and representing the interests of the buyer over the seller. Now, when I called Senator Feinstein's office and asked for comment on this, first of all, the post office declined comment, and CBRE declined comment. And when I called Feinstein's office, I didn't want them to comment on the whole story because that wasn't the important part. One of the things I uncovered, which is in the book, was that Feinstein in 2007 had written a letter to the Postmaster General basically saying, will you go and stop building this huge postal facility in Aliso Viejo, California, and build it on the decommissioned El Toro military base with Lennar Corporation, which she didn't tell the postmaster was partnered at that time with CBRE. It's a very interesting story. In my little ebook, it's called Die-Fying the Blumpire, right? But it turns out that things are not all hunky-dory with the Blumpire, as it were. Since 2008, Mr. Blum's flagship private equity funds that are run by Blum Capital Partners have lost about 80% of their value. They're really going down the tubes. Now, that's really nice, except for I have to tell you that most of that money came from CalPERS. See, you might not clap so much because the Blum mode of operation for the last 20 years, ever since he got a U.S. senator to sit across the breakfast table, if indeed they do eat breakfast together, which is a horrible thought. You know, once you have a senator in your family, you know, people know that, right? And the access to public capital has just been phenomenal for all of Blum's businesses over the years. I mean, not only is he a regent of the University of California who, as Christine mentioned a little while ago, I was able to show had overseen the investment of $1.5 billion in his own business enterprises. A few years before that, I was able to show that Feinstein, as the head of the Military Construction Subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee of the Senate, had overseen over $1 billion worth of contracts to two companies that were owned and chaired by her husband. You know, and so this time when I called them up, they knew who I was, and instead of like saying insulting things this time, they actually tried to be nice, which I thought was really great. It was real advanced. And basically their reply was, well, the same thing they tell everybody who calls them up and says, well, it looks like there's some overlap between Mr. Blum's businesses and the senator's duties as a senator. They always say the same thing. They say, well, their wealth is kept separately. She has a blind trust. And they do not talk about mutual business over breakfast. So the truth of the matter is that you can look at Dianne Feinstein's economic disclosure statement, which, you know, runs anywhere from 250 to 350 pages a year, depending. And you can compare that to the economic disclosure statement of Jay Rockefeller, whose economic disclosure statement runs 8 pages. And you can look at Ms. Feinstein's economic disclosure statement and saying that the bulk of it is Mr. Blum's businesses, which she has to disclose according to law because everybody knows that it's in the family, right? And she's got this little teeny blind trust, which is irrelevant. The fact is that under California community property law, she is entitled to half of every penny he's made since they got married 30 years ago, right? So this argument that they don't share their wealth is ludicrous. It defies common sense, and it defies the law. So basically, as far as I'm concerned, this article on going postal, as well as the other investigations I've been privileged to do on the Blum-Feinstein family complex, is a blueprint for an indictment.
All right.
I've actually, Attorney General Kamala Harris, done your work for you. All you need to do is pick up the East Bay Express, and you'll know what to do. Thank you.
All right.